Thank you, Susan, and thank you all for coming. Dr. Roger Masse is currently an associate professor of wildlife management at SUNY Cobleskill. He is particularly interested in bird ecology and management with an emphasis on American woodcock and other young forest birds. He is also a bird watcher and nature enthusiast. Dr. Masse earned a Bachelor of Science in Wildlife Biology from University of Vermont, a Master of Science in Natural Resources from Delaware State University, and a Doctor of Philosophy in Environmental Science from University of Rhode Island. His interest in birds started during sophomore year of undergraduate studies. He now enjoys sharing that interest and experience with his students at SUNY Cobleskill and his 6- and 4-year-old sons at home and this evening with us. Welcome, Roger.
Thank you, Becky. I appreciate that introduction. Would you like me to go ahead and jump right in, or we're all set to go? Okay, very good. Thank you all for being here. Susan, I noticed as soon as you mentioned raising their hand, Bonnie quickly took her hand down in the attendee list. So as Susan mentioned, if you have questions along the way, put them in the chat, raise your hand with the little raise hand function, and we can think about those along the way as we go. I'm going to share my screen here. You should be able to see the PowerPoint presentation now, and I'll make this full screen and we'll get going. Okay, so thanks again. Thanks again for being here this evening. Today, we're going to be talking about ecology and management of young forest birds in the Northeast generally. Some of this will relate to New York, as you'll see, some of it to parts of New England. So kind of a blanket presentation for the Northeast. Quick overview. We'll start with just considering, so we're all on the same page, what exactly young forest birds are. I'm sure we all have a pretty good idea. But also importantly, why care about them? So why concern ourselves with management of young forest birds? We'll then think about forest change in the Northeast, generally from post-settlement time forward. Think about how common young forests were. That kind of feeds into why care about young forest birds. And we'll think about what the management goals should be for young forest birds. As you'll see, there's not necessarily a clear-cut answer here, and I'll look to you all, hopefully for some dialogue when we get to that point of the presentation. We'll then think about some specific strategies for managing young forests and associated birds. There's timber harvest strategies that we'll quickly overview that are generally used to support young forest species. We'll think about the role of power line rights-of-ways in particular. These are an important landscape feature, especially here in the Northeast. And then I'll highlight some results of a study I conducted in Rhode Island, looking at the potential for American woodcock to serve as an umbrella species for young forest birds. You'll see when we get into that section why I think woodcock are a particularly good fit given their habitat needs. And then to finish out, we'll talk generally about the Young Forest Initiative here in New York, and then I'll highlight some resources for that as well as other initiatives across the Northeast more generally, New England extending over to the upper Midwest. And I'll illustrate the website for the Young Forest Project. And the concluding portion here is really meant to point you all in the direction of resources if you're interested in reports that are generated from state agency work, if you're interested in seeing different projects that are being done around New York and around other parts of the Northeast. Okay, so when we think about young forest birds and what this, what exactly this guild is, generally we're thinking about species that are breeding in younger stages of forest succession. And there's lots of ways that these species have been described. They've been described as shrubland species or thicket species. Some people make the argument that young forest birds do equally well in what you would consider an open woodland or a savanna. So for example, something like the Albany pine bush we could consider that a pine savanna type ecosystem. There are an abundance of young forest birds that thrive there. Forest clearcuts here in the Northeast often are viewed as suitable areas for young forest birds as well. The picture on the bottom left there, that's showing you a 4-year-old regenerating forest clearcut here in the Northeast. And then over on the right, just a collection of species that I'm sure we're all familiar with. These are species that will be returning in not too long. It seems like a long, long ways away with the snow cover, but a month or so, and we'll start getting our first towhees, and the prairie warblers will be coming back, and the field sparrows. And depending on where you are and the snow cover you may or may not have, woodcocks may in fact be back in your area now. As soon as this snow is gone, they'll start to display pretty consistently throughout the month of April as well. One commonality among all of these different kind of descriptions for young forest is that we're dealing with disturbance-dependent species. So especially here in the Northeast, we're dealing with vegetation types that have to experience some sort of disturbance in order to maintain that young forest structure, a high stem density, generally a low canopy, all of these sorts of things that young forest birds thrive in. I put this figure here just to illustrate, in the last slide, I show the 4-year-old clear cut, and it's easy to think, oh, okay, a regenerating clear cut is what a young forest bird likes, or, an abandoned meadow. And when we see just a single picture, it puts a static image in our mind of what young forest is and what these birds need. This figure here and the collection of pictures on the bottom is meant to illustrate that young forest birds, they don't just use necessarily a very narrow section of young forest in terms of age, but rather they'll use a spectrum of ages, generally from very young, so maybe 1 or 2 years old after a forest cut, for example, or after a significant disturbance, up to about 30 years old. And once a forest patch starts to get about 30 years old, we start to see generally less use by many of the young forest species. The figure on the top here, I'll use my cursor just to kind of illustrate parts of the figure. This is illustrating generally the woodcock habitat use strategy. And you can see over here on the far left-hand side, very recent clear cuts or very newly abandoned meadows that have lots of open ground cover. Basically what you're seeing on the bottom left picture, that's what woodcock often use for singing grounds, for roosting fields, these sorts of habitat uses. Once we start getting into 2-year-old forests up to about 10 or 12 or 15-year-old forests, a high stem density, again, low canopy cover over low canopy height overall. This is where we tend to see woodcock doing a lot of feeding, especially on moist soils. So the middle picture here is illustrating a 6-year-old clear cut and the regeneration that we would expect in that sort of vegetation type. And then once we start getting into this 15 to 30-year-old forest patch, that's where the structure starts to change. The tree diameter starts to get a little bit larger. We start to get a little less stem density, and we start to get a bit more open structure beneath. And as a result, with woodcocks, we start to see relatively less use at about 20 to 30 years of age for a forest patch. Trees start getting larger. We start transitioning now from a young forest onto this broad range of ages that we often think of as middle-aged forests, something like maybe 40 to 80 or 90 years old, for example. So why should we care about young forest birds? The short story here is that young forest species as a group have been experiencing noted population declines since we've had long-term monitoring starting in the 60s generally, as a result of habitat loss and degradation. And when we think about loss of habitat for any species, generally we're thinking about conversion of land to other non-habitat land uses. So the easy thing that comes to mind is a parking lot or a box store or some other, non-habitat land use, some human-driven land use. With young forest species, though, and an equally problematic form of habitat degradation is occurring through natural forest succession. So recall from the last slide that once forests age beyond a certain point, generally about 30 years, they start to become less appealing for young forest birds. So in the absence of disturbance, through natural forest succession, patches of forest become less suitable for young forest birds. So this group has really experienced both loss and degradation from human-driven impacts as well as natural forest succession. And to illustrate, I've got a couple of figures here on the screen. This is showing on the left-hand side the distribution of blue-winged warbler. You can see in this figure generally some light reddish colors. This is showing the number of blue-winged warblers that are observed per survey route based on breeding bird survey data. So you can see a fairly general distribution in the eastern half of the US. There's a few hot spots that we have around Kentucky, around Virginia, around West Virginia, up into Wisconsin as well, but generally a lower abundance, fairly broad distribution. The right-hand figure over here, this is illustrating population decline for blue-winged warblers. And the important takeaway from this figure is that the red color and the orange color, those are illustrating significant population declines, whereas the blue is showing areas where populations have been showing some evidence of increase. So it's true that we have a mixture of population decline and population increase, but over most of the species range, we see significant negative declines. There's lots of red is the take-home message on that distribution map for blue-winged warbler. I'm going to click on this link here. This is going to take us to some breeding bird survey data. So bear with me 1 second, and I will share the new screen that I just opened. And you all should now be seeing the North American Breeding Bird Survey website. Becky, can you confirm that you all are able to see that?
Yes, we can.
Okay, perfect. So I'm going to click on the USGS results that they have compiled and analyzed. This data is spanning the period 1966 to 2019. We're going to look at species group summaries. And let me scroll down here. We will look in bird conservation region. We'll select New England and the mid-Atlantic coast. So again, just kind of a regional perspective. And we'll select the option for successional or scrub breeding birds. So these are our young forest birds. And then let's see what we have here. So this table is illustrating of 22 species that are encountered frequently, so encountered on more than 14 of the breeding bird survey routes. 64% of them, as I'm illustrating right here with this highlight, 64% of all of the young forest species that are common are illustrating significant negative trends in this region. So we have a very high proportion, nearly 2/3 of the young forest species in New England and the mid-Atlantic coast that are exhibiting significant population trends. Let's, for comparison, instead of successional birds, let's look at woodland breeding birds now. So this would be typically our more mature forest types of species. We'll keep the same region and we'll take a look at this data. So we have woodland breeding birds, 1966 to 2019, New England, mid-Atlantic coast. And if we look at this proportion here with significant negative trends, we only have 19% of this guild, of this group of woodland breeding birds that are experiencing significant negative trends. So our forest breeding birds, generally more mature forest breeding birds, on a whole are doing a little bit better than young forest birds at the moment. That wasn't always the case. If we were to look at what our mature forest species were doing, say back in the 60s and 70s, it would be a different story. But through time, we've had a lot of progression of forest land across the Northeast. And so these species have really benefited from that. At the moment, though, our young forest species are really kind of taking it on the chin, so to speak. So we should be back at the PowerPoint now, and we'll continue on here. Thinking about post-settlement forest change across the Northeast. Historically, it's true that young forests were not all that common. And it's interesting, this conservation issue, because on one hand, some people argue that we really need to be mindful and active in managing young forest birds. But on the other hand, people point to the fact that young forests historically were not that common. And so why bother necessarily worrying about young forest species that are currently declining? Those are both equally valid points. And as managers, it's our job to try to kind of balance those interests and come up with a management goal that we can live with, that we could implement, that satisfies numerous different stakeholders. So if we think back to pre-settlement times, say around the 1700s, and you look into the literature, across much of the Northeast, we were looking at a vast majority in relatively old or old growth timberland. So up to 93% of the Northeastern landscape historically existing in older growth forest. At that time, young forest in some areas accounting for up to about 13%. Those higher percentages, 10, 12, 13% of young forest would have been associated most likely with coastal areas, areas that perhaps had more influence from storms like hurricanes, for instance, areas with a higher degree of Native American land use as well. Major river valleys, parts of southern New England, for example, there's a very rich documented history of Native American settlement, and through their intentional management of forests, creating patches of young forest that would have led to higher percentages in those areas. When we think about historical disturbances that created young forest, this is kind of a collection here of different ways in which the Northeastern forest was impacted. So we have in this top left, straight line winds, maybe from tornadoes, for example, or strong thunderstorms creating straight line winds. Of course, the occasional forest fire creating patches of young forest. Perhaps more common than fires would have been ice storms or heavy snowfall, leading to damaged canopy that would give way to patches of young forest. Down on the bottom left here, this figure is illustrating the approximate frequency of hurricane damage associated with F2 hurricanes over New England. And you can see here the coastal areas, not surprisingly, experiencing damage from hurricanes much more commonly than inland parts of New England. But still, hurricane damage from time to time would have been expected to cause changes in forest succession. The two small pictures in the middle here, we have some biological agents at work, insect damage being shown in the middle picture here. Beaver damage, of course, very important across parts of the Northeast in creating patches of young forest, also helping to maintain areas of grassland, thinking of now beaver meadows forming following the flooding of beaver ponds and subsequent loss of those dam structures. And then in the bottom right here, this is a figure that's illustrating in southern New England the locations, each of these open circles here, the locations of Native American settlement, and then the lines are what are believed to be major networks of paths or travel corridors between these. So Native Americans across southern New England, and again, major river valleys, these sorts of landscapes exerting an impact on forest as well, historically. It's important to note, though, that these disturbances, although important, generally were rather small in size and rather localized as well. So when we think in future slides about young forest management, it's important to understand that we're not talking about whole-scale landscape conversion to young forest. We're really thinking about smaller scale, strategic, intentional management to create patches of young forest that are within a larger mosaic of forested land now on our northeastern landscape. If we fast forward from the 1700s, early 1700s into 1740, say mid 1700s, we start to see the rise of subsistence farming, early European settlement. So small patches of land being cleared, small agricultural establishments being developed, but still a predominantly forested landscape. If we fast forward in time into the mid 1800s, generally into the late 1800s, notice the difference in these pictures. We now have nearly a whole-scale conversion from a predominantly forested, if not entirely forested landscape, to a predominantly herbaceous landscape. So widespread, large-scale agriculture existing around the mid 1800s. And you can see in this bottom figure here, this is showing a couple of things. We have different states in New England, the same general pattern we could infer here in New York as well, but New England states with different colors. On the left-hand y-axis, we have the percent forest cover. And then on the right-hand y-axis, we have the estimated population of New England. And on the x-axis, we have the year. And you can see that 1650, 1700, very low population. We have a very high proportion of forest land in the Northeast, 90%, 93% or so. And as population starts to take off, essentially explode with colonization, we start to see a decrease, drastic decrease in the proportion of forest land. And around 1850, we see these lows, which are indicating about 30% of the landscape now being forested. That remained forested was almost always cut over in some manner for timber products. But then following the 1850s, with further population increase, we now see a rebound in the extent of forest. So following the 1850s, we start to see agricultural abandonment across the Northeast. We start to see populations moving now to population centers, leaving agricultural land behind, essentially. And we see regeneration of the forested landscape. In the early 1900s, there was an abundance of valuable timber in the form of pine on the landscape. And so we see what essentially was a second harvest, almost, lots of cutting of pine resources to use for building materials. And that led to what you see down here in the bottom left, really a foot in the door for young hardwood species to take advantage and to start to really form an abundance, large-scale, widespread abundance of young deciduous hardwood forest. So from the 1915s into the 20s, into the 1930s, we start to see lots and lots of young forest on the landscape. This is the time when we likely had the highest abundances of our young forest birds on the landscape, given this tremendous influx now of newly regenerating young forest habitat. This figure here, this is some data from the U.S. Forest Service, their forest inventory and analysis program. It's showing the percent of what they call seedling sapling timberland. We can think of that as young forest. For two different regions, we have the mid-Atlantic region with the squares here, and then we have New England with the circles. And you can see from the late 1940s through the late 1960s and mid-1970s, we have these highs of 30 to 40% of these regions being comprised of seedling sapling timberland. So again, this is the time period when our young forest birds were likely at their maximum abundance. Lots of habitat for them on the land, and their populations likely thriving. Following the early 1970s, we start to see a decrease in the proportion of seedling sapling timberland. Forests are starting to age. we're generally managing forests in a different way during this time period. And if we were to extend this x-axis, if we increased the length of this into the 2000s and the 2010s, you would see these trends continue to decline. The red line that I have on this figure here, the dashed line, this is illustrating that approximate maximum extent of young forest historically, about 13% in some regions. And as of the 2000s, most areas were well below this. And an example that I give, approximately 3% of forest land in Rhode Island was in young stages as of 2011. And that's significant because it illustrates a very small percentage in a state, a coastal state, where we would expect there to be a little bit more pervasive disturbances to create young forest. So a coastal state with a very, very small percentage of young forest. So the inland states also experiencing a similar, very small percentage. New York, about 3% in most wildlife management areas, which we'll talk about towards the end of the presentation today. So with that change in forest, of course, comes changes in wildlife. And this figure here is illustrating relative abundance for different types of species. And it also has overlaying here this green line showing the extent of forest, which mirrors essentially that last figure I showed with forest extent and human population. So we see this plunge in forest essentially as this green line dips. We see lots of our forest species, things like passenger pigeon, wolf, mountain lion, turkeys, beaver, etc., deer, moose, all similarly decline. Some of them become locally extirpated. And simultaneously, with this low dip in forest cover, we see a very high peak now with our grassland species, things like bobolink and meadowlark, for example. Lots of herbaceous cover, lots of agricultural fields, this sort of thing. So these bobolinks and meadowlarks, other grassland species, doing very well around 1800, the early 1800s, much to the demise, of course, of the forest species. However, once forest starts to rebound, forest cover starts to rebound, again, late 1800s now into, say, the mid 1900s, we have this influx of forest. That's that time period when our young forest species were likely at their peak abundances. So that brings us into thinking about what should the management goal be for young forest birds. Here we have a nice, stunning male golden-winged warbler. We've got a clear cut down here on the bottom, illustrating what this habitat might look like. Some folks argue or suggest that we should have a goal to manage for pre-settlement levels of young forest, pre-settlement populations of young forest birds. What are some thoughts that you all have about that goal? Do you think that this is a good goal? Are there challenges you can think about that would make this a difficult thing to implement? What are some thoughts that folks have?
Okay, I'm going to open the mic for Celia. Go ahead, Celia. You can unmute your microphone.
I recall reading about the Everglades that some people were interested in getting the animal populations, the bird populations back to what they were. And what they found was because of climate change, you could put a lot of effort and a lot of money into getting the old populations back, but what they found was that with climate change, it wouldn't work as well. So they had to mitigate everything to account for the climate change.
Yes, Celia, that's a great point. And there's a similar concern here as well, right? In theory, sure, it's tempting, I'll say, to put our manager hat on and say, let's strive for creating pre-settlement conditions in our forest. But in practice, we're not in pre-settlement times. We've had pervasive human impacts across our landscape. Climate change, right? One of them. What are some other changes to the forest that you all are familiar with since post-settlement times that would make it difficult to go forward with management as a goal for pre-settlement times? How has the forest changed since then? Andy?
Well, it's
Oh, your sound seems to be breaking up a little bit, Andy.
Andy, I wonder if you could use the chat or the Q&A. We're having some trouble hearing you.
All right, we have Nancy. I'm gonna open up your microphone. Okay, and it's telling me you're using an older version of Zoom, so I need to promote you to a panelist. So hang on just a second while that happens. Okay, Nancy. Oh, I think we lost Nancy. Okay, Jennifer.
Yeah, I was thinking about the deer population creating havoc with a lot of
So can you hear me?
growth and shrub and brush.
Yeah, Jennifer, exactly. So deer numbers now are different than they were then, right? And so we have impacts of herbivores, impacts of browsers that we wouldn't have necessarily had to contend with in the same manner pre-settlement times. Nancy, you're with us now. Have you got a thought here?
Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay. So just the structure of the forest has changed in that the chestnut is gone.
That's a great, yeah, that's a great point, Nancy.
You know, the elms are going, and now the hemlocks are in danger.
Yeah, so perfect points, Nancy. Chestnuts are gone and not coming back anytime soon in the capacity that they were.
Yeah.
We have elms that were, effectively lost from our landscape. You all, I'm sure, are familiar with beech disease, right? So a number of issues that make managing for pre-settlement conditions really, really challenging, and in my opinion, probably not a feasible goal. The very fact that we're dealing with things like climate change, we're dealing with a very different society now, a very different pressure from people on our modern landscapes, make managing for pre-settlement levels very, very difficult. So some people say, okay, we can't do pre-settlement. Let's manage for the 1960s and 1970s when we first started tracking young forest birds and we first started tracking forest breeding birds using the breeding bird survey, for example. What are some issues with this as a management goal? Why might we not necessarily want to prescribe to managing for the levels of the 1960s and 1970s?
Roger, there was a comment that invasive species seem to take over quickly.
Yeah, that's a very good point as well, right? And that feeds into, I can't remember if it was Nancy or Jennifer, but talking about, I think it was Nancy, talking about the fact that our forest structure is very, very different now than it was historically, and invasive species fit right into that as well. That's a good point. Thinking about the 1960s and 1970s, why might it be challenging to manage for those levels of young forest and young forest birds?
Roger, we do have another comment in regards to fragmentation of forest in migration corridors.
Yeah, yep, that's another excellent point, and that really relates to the fact that we're using landscapes in a very different manner now, right? We have a very high degree of fragmentation compared to pre-settlement times. lots of the land uses that are now in effect are not, going to be going away. Think of the infrastructure that we have, population centers, towns, cities, these sorts of things. So that fragmentation piece, corridors is an interesting example. We'll talk about that with power line rights of way. But certainly the composition of our landscapes is very different as well. Can anyone think of an issue with setting the 1960s and 1970s as a management goal? Maybe this is what we should manage for. I don't know personally. But what are some issues that you might think about if we set the 1960s and 1970s as a target for young forest birds?
Okay, we have Jennifer. Go ahead, Jennifer.
Yeah, one of the things I could possibly say is that the interest of the larger group of population in conservation and issues of habitat change and habitat restoration was maybe more prominent in the 60s and 70s. I'm not sure.
Yeah, Jennifer, that's
but also the cost of doing it.
Yeah, that's a good point. So we had a very different mindset, conservation mindset in the 60s and 70s than we do now, right? And to your point about cost, Jennifer, the 60s and 70s, this was a period in time, admittedly, when young forest birds in the Northeast, there's wide agreement, they were at artificially high levels at this time because we were coming off of this, decades of forest regeneration following farm abandonment and these sorts of things. So we had an artificially high population of young forest birds. And if we were to set that as the goal, to go back to the 60s and 70s, for instance, we'd have to do widespread, extensive landscape conversion now to get that amount of young forest to support those levels of young forest birds. And that intensity of management would be really hard to sell to the public. And it would be very, very costly as well, if not impossible to do because of the way ownership of property has been fragmented through time. So now we're dealing with lots of landowners owning small pieces. So management at big landscape levels becomes really challenging. There are, someone in the chat here, Andy, forest fragmentation skews the value of total acreage to forest nesting birds. So while land may be returning to mature woodlot, it is not necessarily as beneficial as it was in the 1700s. That's a great point, Andy. And that ties into what some of the other folks had mentioned about differences in forest structure, about fragmentation, these sorts of things. Changing older woodlots to young forests to benefit species that are relatively abundant, even though in some decline, does not seem like wise management. And in some places, Andy, that's absolutely true. And that's why we want to be mindful about, it's not just a question of how much young forest to create, for example, but rather, should we create young forest? Some landscapes are better for that than others. If we decide we should create, how much should we create? Keeping in mind those historical benchmarks. And then we've decided we should create and we've decided how much to create. The next question is where to create, right? And so there's multiple levels that go into this type of decision making to make sure, to Andy's point, when we have resources, older forest that is beneficial to certain groups of species, we probably want to protect those areas. And there might be other portions of a landscape that make more sense for young forest management in a more limited capacity. So my point here was not to necessarily sell a certain management goal, but rather generate some conversation. In my mind, neither of these two options here, pre-settlement or 1960s to 1970s, neither of those seem viable in my opinion. Personally, I tend to prescribe to maintaining some proportion of young forest, generally at most about 10% on some landscapes, so that we can ensure that these species don't continue to decline to the point where they may become extirpated. So in my kind of biologist mindset, I'm more concerned with maintaining viable populations of young forest birds. Yes, they may continue to decline into the future decade, but hopefully we'll start to see them level out as we initiate some targeted young forest management to keep them on our landscapes. So some strategies for managing young forest birds. Because we're dealing with forest succession, we're essentially thinking about options of vegetation management to reset forest succession, to get back those younger stages of forest growth. We can do that mechanically, so we can conduct timber harvesting. We can use herbicide treatment if we have plots of land that we want to maintain in young forest, maybe herbicide treatment to limit the impact of invasive species, for instance. We could use prescribed burning as well. You can see in the bottom left here, commonly used at the Albany pine bush. I see Celia here in the chat. When a clear-cut forest regrows, the species are not the same as the original growth. He said it can take decades to centuries to return to the original species. Yes, that is 100% true, Celia. Oftentimes when you are clear-cutting a patch of forest, the very first species that return, we call them R-selected species. They grow quickly. Their seeds often spread through wind dispersion, so things like aspen, things like birch, that sort of thing. They're generally short-lived. They don't necessarily get very big, right? And so those are the first ones to invade, if you will, a recent forest clear-cut. And through time, they give way to your more shade-tolerant species that you might see in a mature forest, 150 years down the road, basically. With young forest birds, we're thinking more about structure of the forest and less about tree species composition. For example, a young forest, a 10-year-old patch of forest that's comprised of something like aspen, for example, that's beneficial for young forest birds, but a forest clear-cut at Bear Swamp management area in Otsego County, for instance, that is dominated by things like birch and regenerating red maple that's growing from the stumps of cut trees. We call that coppice growth. That is also beneficial young forest, even though the species composition of trees may be different. So we're really thinking about forest structure now with resetting forest succession. So some timber harvest strategies that we often see being used. One is the clear cutting method. Oftentimes when folks hear the word clear cut, they have a very negative reaction to it. The strategy here is to remove all the trees in a given area. Some pros and cons associated with clear cutting. It's a very effective way to create young forest. It's indiscriminate, so you go in, you mark boundaries, and you remove all the canopy trees. So it's fairly fast compared to other methods, and the end result is an even-aged chunk of forest that is starting at age 0, effectively, for a forest stand. One of the biggest cons associated with forest clear cutting tends to be the negative view that the general public often has to forest clear cutting. And this kind of dates back to the 60s and 70s and 80s, some of the negative mindset associated with clear cutting. I'll bother to mention, though, a short while back when I talked about managing for young forests, keep in mind, we're not talking about landscape conversion here. So we're not talking about large scale, widespread landscape level clear cutting. We're talking about smaller, strategic, well-placed clear cuts to create young forest. Another option that we could use is called the seed tree method. That's what this looks like on the bottom left. The seed tree method, the strategy here is to clear most of the canopy trees, but to retain anywhere from 5 to 10 or so mast producing trees. So maybe you leave oaks, for example, maybe you leave cherries. so that they can provide not only food resources for wildlife, but also seed sources to help advance regeneration of desirable species on that site. Some pros and cons with the seed tree method. It tends to look better to many people than a clear cut, so it tends to be more favorable among the public. You're intentionally leaving some food resources or some seed resources to help regeneration. Those are beneficial consequences as well. On the downside, when you remove most of a canopy and you leave seed trees, those trees are then going to experience different pressures that they wouldn't necessarily experience in a more closed canopy setting. For example, wind disturbance will be elevated. The patch of forest generally will be drier, given less canopy. So there's stress that will be placed on these trees. They may not produce the same level of mast as they did historically. Some of them may even die as a result of those stresses, or maybe that stress in addition to something like insect damage, for example. A question here, how does the clear-cut method affect the soil that's left around the stumps? That's a really good question, Joanne. So clear-cutting, you're going to be creating a drier atmosphere, a drier microclimate, I should say, in the soil in the short term. Once you start to get some advanced regeneration and shade now being created on the ground, that area, 5-10 years down the line, will start to recover that moisture content. Andy, I see you have your hand up. Uh-oh, did you go in the chat, Andy?
No, that was an error. That was an error.
Okay. So another approach that we can use is called the shelterwood method, and that's what's being shown here. The shelterwood method involves the systematic removal of canopy trees. So you have to go into the forest stand multiple times, generally over a 10-year period or 15-year period. And each time you enter into the forest stand, you take more of the canopy trees out. The initial harvest, you might take something like 30 to 50% of the trees. And then maybe 5 or 10 years later, you go in and take 20% of the remaining canopy trees. And you might even enter that stand a third time to remove the last of the canopy trees during a shelterwood harvest. A shelterwood harvest can be beneficial because it really allows protection of those seedlings that are being reestablished. They're essentially establishing themselves under the shelter of some remaining canopy. This is also a pretty visually appealing strategy for creating young forest as well. So people tend to be very comfortable with this approach. When you look at a shelter woodcut, you see canopy trees, you see some advanced regeneration in the understory. You have a softer change through time compared to something like a clear cut. The downside with a shelter cut or a shelter woodcut is that it takes more time to create a true young forest patch. And it also takes more resources, right? We have to now enter into the forest stand multiple times to create the same type of young forest that we could using something like a clear cut or a seed tree method. So in all of these cases, as I mentioned, the goal is or should be similar. And ultimately, it's to create what we call a forest mosaic across our landscape. So we're not thinking about converting an entire landscape to young forest or to clear cut, for example, but rather being strategic and being selective in where we put these management blocks or management patches, and ultimately leading to what we call age class diversification. So moving away from a landscape that's this homogeneous, for example, 100-year-old forest, and intentionally creating small blocks of timberland where we reset succession so that we can have diversity now in our forest age. Remember, historically, those various disturbances that I mentioned, they did the work for us. in terms of creating these small patches of young forest that these young forest birds tended to inhabit. Given a lack of those types of disturbances, it now often requires much more active management to mimic that distribution, that patchwork or mosaic, if you will, of different forest age classes. Importantly, what we often see in terms of applied management is a staggered entry into these management blocks. So, for example, this picture on the bottom, right, this is showing a part of the Adirondack Park. You can see an older clear cut in the background, a couple of newer clear cuts in the middle and foreground, and then over here on the left, a couple-year-old regenerating clear cut. In order to make sure that we have different ages of forest, we can enter into these areas at different intervals. So maybe in 2023, we make one clear cut, and in 2028, we make another clear cut. So now we have a 5-year-old clear cut, and we have a new clear cut that we've put on the landscape. And moreover, we can revisit those same areas every 20 or 30 years and reapply that same type of active management to maintain patches of young forest without necessarily needing to put new acreage on the ground. So once we develop a young forest management plan, if we return to those sites every couple of decades, basically, and reset succession, we can ensure that we have those patches of young forest. Joanne, is clear cutting the most used approach? It's certainly one of the more common ones for sure, partly because of its efficiency. Takes less time to implement. We also see the seed tree method being used quite a bit too, intentionally identifying some valuable mast trees to leave on the landscape. Eileen is asking, is this type of management specific for birds or for forest health in general? From a wildlife perspective, Eileen, this type of strategy, age class diversification, is beneficial for more than just birds, for sure. There are mammals that benefit. There are herpetofauna that benefit from this type of management. And I would argue from a forest health perspective too, having different aged forest is generally a good thing. When we think about our modern forest landscape, we have an awful lot of acreage that's all very, very similar in age. It looks very similar. And that homogeneous type of forest, opens the door for a lack of resiliency, for instance, from things like natural disturbances. So by having different ages of our timberland, we can help guard against some of those potentially negative consequences. It's important, though, to keep in mind that when we're thinking about young forest management, we want to be mindful that historically these were not terribly common on the landscape. So we want to keep that in mind as we're thinking about management goals and objectives. This is an example of a young forest management plot in Rhode Island, illustrating that idea of staggered entry and return intervals. The areas in red here, they equal about 100 acres of upland forest at the Great Swamp Management Area in Rhode Island. And surrounding this area is about 3,000 acres of different cover types. There's some agricultural fields. It's mostly forested. So we're dealing with a small proportion of the management area. And you can see here the years where each of these patches were clear cut. So a number of patches, 3 of them were clear cut in 1995. Some of them were clear cut in 2007. Some of them were clear cut in 2012. Some of them in 2017. So we have this staggered approach. And then each of these patches will be revisited on a 30-year rotation so that at Great Swamp Management Area, the same 100 acres, in theory, will exist in young forest of different ages from about 0 to 20 years old through time. And we'll be revisiting those as managers as time goes on to keep them in young forest so that our young forest species can thrive on that landscape. Moving forward, thinking about the role of power line rights of ways, I'm sure you're all familiar with these features on the landscape. They're unique in that they require continual treatment, both mechanical treatment and herbicide treatment, specifically to keep young vegetation present. So to keep trees small, to keep shrubs, established on the site. In short, we don't want tall trees growing in our transmission lines. So managers keep these areas perpetually in young forest. They also represent a linear landscape feature. Someone mentioned connectivity and fragmentation previously. With young forest birds, power line rights of way can really serve as suitable habitat in some landscapes. And we can use them strategically to help connect now different patches of young forest. The right-hand side here is illustrating what you're all familiar with, I'm sure, with power line rights of way. On the left-hand side, we have an aerial image of Great Swamp Management Area in Rhode Island. You can see the linear feature here where my cursor is. This is a power line right of way that bisects the management area, both to this kind of southwest northeast direction and then east-west. And then there's also a portion that goes more north-south through the management area. Over here, these are the patches that I showed in the previous slide that are managed for young forest. And there are also patches of young forest in this section of the management area in Rhode Island. And so they're connected essentially via the power line right-of-way there, which itself can serve as habitat for young forest species. Jerry Ann is asking, is there a group of people who study these management areas for successful breeding of birds or other fauna to see if this management is effective? Yes, there are folks, Jerry Ann, that study these types of things. And your question is timely because I'm showing here some data for chestnut-sided warblers from power line rights of way across New Hampshire. And you can see here, the top panel is showing the percent of nests that were depredated. The crosshatch bars are the year 2000. So in the year 2000, there was a bit more depredation of nests than there was in 1999. The middle panel is showing the survival of nests. Daily nest survival is what we calculate to illustrate the survival probability of a nest on any given day of the nesting cycle. And you can see that for power line rights of ways that are very narrow down here, 0 to 5 meters from the edge, or over here on the right-hand side, 15 or more meters from the edge, we have fairly decent nest survival rates overall, 0.95% to 100% nest survival throughout the nesting season. And then the bottom panel is showing the number of fledglings per nesting attempt. And you can see that in both years, numerous young are being fledged on average from nests that are being created by chestnut-sided warblers in power line rights of way. So there's evidence from folks that study young forest songbirds suggesting that these rights of ways in some regions can in fact serve as what we call source patches. Essentially, they're patches of habitat that represent some degree of high quality that allow for species to successfully reproduce and survive in these areas. Changing gears a little bit and thinking now about American woodcock. As you heard in the introduction, I'm biased to this species. A study that I conducted in Rhode Island was really meant to take a look at the question of whether or not woodcock could serve as what we call an umbrella species for young forest birds. If you remember this figure from early on, this is showing woodcock habitat use, and I'm flagging here the singing grounds that are used for breeding. They're required for breeding without these open areas, often that are created from forest cutting or maybe from agricultural activity. Without those areas, woodcock do not breed, and so they're a critical component of woodcock habitat. And by managing those and creating patches of young forest, the idea is that other species that are also declining may benefit from that habitat that's being managed for woodcock. And so I've got a collection of species here: prairie warbler, field sparrow, eastern towhee. The red numbers there, those are the percent declines per year of those populations since 1966. And so we look to collect some data to answer this question of, is the woodcock an umbrella species? And we believed it was, so that was our hypothesis moving forward. And we predicted that if woodcock were an umbrella species, then we would expect the abundance of young forest birds, the number of individuals, the number of birds across all species, and also the diversity of birds, we would expect those to all be higher at woodcock singing grounds compared to random forest sites around these management areas. So what we did is we conducted a series of standard point counts during May and July at each of the management areas that we were studying in Rhode Island. And some of these point counts in the figure here, they're illustrated by the blue circles. Some of these were conducted at woodcock singing grounds. So these were places that were managed for woodcock that we confirmed woodcock were displaying. And then the other group of points were randomly located forest points within the management area. In this figure, they're shown by the red dots. We would navigate to each of these points. We would then conduct these point counts, identifying all of the birds that we saw and that we heard, so that we could record relative abundance, the total number of birds, and also the diversity of birds. And this is what we found. The dark bars are showing the average number of individuals for each species at singing grounds, and then the light colored bars are showing the average number of individuals at random forest sites. And you can see at the three management areas, Big River is in blue, Arcadia is in red, Great Swamp is in magenta. The dark bars, so the birds that had the highest abundances at woodcock singing grounds tended to be those young forest species: gray catbird, yellow warbler, common yellowthroat, cedar waxwing, gray catbird, and prairie warbler in particular up at Great Swamp. And so we started to develop some support for the idea that if you manage landscapes with woodcock in mind, so specifically creating elements of woodcock habitat, you're likely to also benefit young forest birds. When you look at the light bars, notice that the light bars, their highest values are for those more mature forest species, which is what we would expect as well. So things like veery, things like red-eyed vireo, northern water thrush, they were more commonly documented at those random forest sites. And that makes sense. Those random sites were not necessarily managed. They tended to be older. And so we had these older forest species being more abundant at those sites. This figure here is showing the number and diversity of birds, same color scheme. So the dark color is the number of birds or diversity of birds at woodcock singing grounds, the light color at random forest sites. And you can see here that we had higher numbers of birds and higher diversity of birds at woodcock singing grounds as a whole now compared to those random forest sites. So there really is a benefit for woodcock management beyond just that one species. And that's what essentially defines an umbrella species. So we found some support for our hypothesis, which was great, because we can now try to convince folks that, you know, the American woodcock, not only is it a cool bird, but if you manage for that species, you're also likely to benefit lots of other species that require similar types of habitat. So we often think of, instead of woodcock wearing a hat, they wear an umbrella, and lots of other species, whether it's whippoorwill here in the middle, or common yellowthroat, or blue-winged warbler, or chestnut-sided warbler, indigo bunting, lots and lots of other species, especially those young forest birds, are benefiting from woodcock habitat management. Woodcock are also an ideal species, in my opinion, because there's a long history of managing for them, particularly because of their interest as an upland game bird. And so there's well-established best management practices for how to create woodcock habitat on landscapes. And so we have these prescriptions basically from region to region for what landowners can do to create quality woodcock habitat. And by implementing those, we're likely to see some conservation benefit for these non-target species as well. So to close out, I just wanted to highlight some resources primarily that really help to illustrate young forest initiatives in New York and beyond. Since 2015, the DEC, some of you are familiar with this, I'm sure, the DEC has instituted the Young Forest Initiative on wildlife management areas. So this is focusing timber harvest management on wildlife management areas in the state. And the goal is to manage 10% of the forest land in young forest across the wildlife management areas. And so the total across management areas is about 12,000 acres. The state's been hard at work. They've got lots of work to do, but recognize that we're dealing with a small percentage, which is the way it ought to be. So we're not thinking about that goal of the 1960s and 1970s, but rather a more achievable goal of a small percentage that will maintain areas of young forest to encourage these species to be able to persist on these landscapes. This picture here is illustrating a recent seed tree cut that's up at the Tug Hill Wildlife Management Area. You can see a very open landscape immediately post-harvest with a number of these mast producing trees being left, again, to provide food resources, to provide seed for regeneration. And then also it helps to create a more visually appealing forest patch for people. So people like these types of areas too. Here's some other pictures. On the left-hand side, we have Partridge Run Wildlife Management Area. The top left is showing a recent clear cut, and the bottom left is showing that same site 5 years later. So within just a very short amount of time, we have very quick regeneration in these young forest patches and a very different looking landscape. And then on the right-hand side, I have a picture from Bear Spring Mountain Wildlife Management Area in New York. And I put this one in here really to illustrate that we're not talking about, again, landscape conversion to young forest here. We have a fairly small amount in this one picture of young forest. You can see where my cursor is here. That's surrounded basically by a much larger landscape of more mature forest. So we're talking about small patches, generally 5 acres or so, scattered around the landscape to help provide habitat for these young forest species. I'm going to show you really quickly. Let me share the DEC's website. So you all should be able to see the Young Forest Initiative website for the DEC. And if you're interested, you can visit this website. You can scroll through here. You can see how they define young forests. So they're thinking generally 20 years or less, intermediate forest, 20 to 50 years, mature forest, 50 to 140 years or so. You can read about some of the species they focus on, some of their goals. So here you have 10% of forested land across the wildlife management areas. And if you're interested, down here towards the bottom, you can see some of the reports that the state has put out regarding their strategic management, some of the preliminary results that they have. So looking at the response of the public to young forest management, some of the baseline data for the wildlife response to young forest management as well. Okay, so lots of resources for you to take a look at if you're interested. I see Jerry Ann. Let me switch back to the PowerPoint here, and then I'll look at these questions. So Jerry Ann is asking, I have a patch of land in the village of Milford, maybe 3 to 5 acres. Can anything be done on that to support this initiative of young forest? How can I learn to care for my land in a supportive way? Jerry Ann, that's a great question. The website that I just showed, the DEC's Young Forest Initiative website, if you Google that, DEC Young Forest Initiative, they have resources there that landowners can look at to help consider ways that they could support this type of initiative. 3 to 5 acres, it's not out of the question. What would be interesting to see is what is around your property. If your property, for example, is surrounded by older closed canopy forest, 3 to 5 acres might not be that beneficial for young forest management. But if there's some other patches around you that are also providing some young forest, even if you had an acre or 2 that you could manage, that would likely help add more wildlife diversity to your property. Andy, just to speak up for the forest birds again, creating young forest will increase already overabundant deer populations. This in turn increases overbrowsing of forest understory, putting at risk species such as wood thrush, black-throated blue, etc. I can support maintaining existing young forest, but DEC's approach is to remove mature forest on state land and create woodcock habitat, not a particularly good trade-off. I tend to agree in some of those cases, Andy, and that's why I really want to make clear that there needs to be, and there is, I would say, there's careful thought to where these, or there should be careful thought to where these areas of young forest go, and more importantly, how they're maintained into the future. So rather than creating new patches of young forest all over the place, having a return interval so that we can keep the same areas of young forest through time, but recognizing we have to have active management in order to do that. At the same time, though, Andy, to your point, very well taken, we need to be mindful of the mature forest species as well. So the things like black-throated blues and wood thrushes, we don't want to be conserving young forest species at the detriment of those mature forest species, for sure. The overabundant deer, issue, that's an issue whether we create young forest or not. Unfortunately, we've got lots of deer, and we can talk about different management approaches for those. That's a little bit of a different issue. I think deer are here to stay in high numbers, I think, regardless of what we do with the forest. We need to introduce wolves, reintroduce wolves. I also wanted to highlight the Young Forest Project. This is a collaborative regional effort to manage and to maintain young forest. There's projects across New England, the Mid-Atlantic region, the Upper Midwest as well. And the point of the Young Forest Project is really to help compile resources and educational materials and reports to disseminate to state agencies, to the federal government, to private landowners, to really help encourage an understanding of young forest, ways in which people can support these types of initiatives, and to illustrate the benefit that young forest management can have when it's done properly. And so I'll take you to this website, youngforest.org. Let me share this. And just to illustrate, there's a number of tabs here that you can scroll through. If you're interested in looking at specific habitat projects, you can click on these regions here. Let's look at New England, for example. Each of these locations, here we have the Connecticut Hills, here we have Hampshire County, Massachusetts. You can click on each of these and look at the specifics of the type of management that's taking place. The Mid-Atlantic, which is where New York is occurring, we have the St. Lawrence Valley in northern New York. So the initiative there focusing primarily on golden wing warblers. So you can read about the strategies that are being implemented there. How to make it, there's kind of a simple slogan that they've come up with. I'm talking about the young forest kind of management community, where we're thinking now in fives, basically. So if you have 5-acre blocks that you can manage every 5 years to keep at least 5% of forest land in young forest. So 5-5 tends to be a slogan that we see in the forest community. Lisa has a will the looming loss of ashes and hemlocks create young forest-like habitat? And the answer there is yes in the term. So ash trees account for something like 7% of timberland in New York, and if we lose all of those, it's going to open the canopy and allow for an emission of young forest vegetation that will transition into older forests. So, you know, Andy, to your point, with targeted young forest management, it may very well be the case that as the effects of emerald ash borer really start to take shape, when we lose hemlocks and things like that, if there are patches of young forest that are created with those sorts of disturbances, it might be wise from a management perspective to keep some of those areas in young forest intentionally to account for this, say 10% or so on management areas, if that is a feasible thing, if that's a feasible thing to do. Andy, I agree fully with the stopping of coyote hunting as well. Separate note though. Okay, so Young Forest Project, again, lots of resources there if you're interested in learning. And Andy, just you prefaced a little bit with my closing point here, which is great. I'm glad that you did. The closing point that I wanted to make, I don't want any of you walking away thinking that I'm, you know, going around telling everybody to cut their trees because it's good for you know, woodcock and chestnut-sided warblers. But the fact of the matter is, as folks began studying young forests intensively, they started to find that young forests were good for more than just young forest birds. And this was one particularly important study in 2012 that came out from some researchers at UMass Amherst. And what they found was that during the post-fledging period, so following successful nesting, once those young have left the nest, a number of mature forest breeding birds, and Andy, you flagged here black-throated blue warbler in one of your questions. This is one of the species that they found post-fledging was actually more abundant in patches of young forest than in older forest. So what happens is these young leave the nest after a successful nest attempt. They start moving around the landscape. And what these researchers did is they used constant effort mist netting and were able to document a higher abundance of species like red-eyed vireo, like black-throated blue warbler, like Blackburnian warbler, mature forest breeding species that were more abundant in young forest following that fledging period. So these areas of young forest, whether it's food resources, maybe an increase in insect abundance, maybe it's protective cover. They're very complex, lots of woody stems, so they could provide protection for these young post-fledging. So young forest, yes, we often think of it as catering to the young forest species, but mature forest species also seem to make use of these patches, especially during the post-fledging period with their young. Okay, so with that, I'll take any final questions that folks might have. Thanks for folks with your questions during the presentation. Are there any final thoughts that folks have before we part ways?
Eileen has mentioned that invasive vegetation must be a challenge, especially in utility right-of-way areas. How do you generally manage for that?
Yeah, invasive species, a very tough challenge. What we see with invasive species, there's this concept called the invasion curve that starts at a very low level and then kind of increases exponentially. And at a very low level of invasion, so early on in an invasion, we might be able to eradicate invasive species. That's pretty unusual. Early detection is key in order for that to take place. What we usually see is that an invasive species gets established, it starts to increase in abundance, and we can throw a lot of resources at them to keep them in check, but not necessarily remove them from the landscape. If an invasive species becomes so common on the landscape that it's just too resource intense to try to really mitigate the effects of. Something like honeysuckle, for example, is tremendously established virtually everywhere. We tend to switch to what we call asset management, where we target certain resources that we need to protect and do what we can to mitigate the effects of the invasive species on those resources. So with power line rights of way, what we often see is the application of herbicides, for instance, to help control invasive species. Good question. John, I see you're here. Thanks for tuning in, John. And the Pine Bush Preserve shout out. Yes, I'm glad to hear that you have got some woodcocks displaying there. I have dreams, John, of doing urban woodcock study within the Albany Pine Bush. I think it'd be a fascinating thing. We just need to find a funding source. If any of you happen to know a money tree growing somewhere, that would be an awesome program.
Roger, when I post the webinar online next week, I'd like to include links to some of the resources that you have in the presentation. Could you email that to me, just a list of links, and I'll go ahead and add that to the page where the webinar will live.
Yeah, I can certainly do that. I can also, if you want, I'm not sure if you have the chat open, Susan, but I can drop them in the chat right now.
Awesome. Yep,
so
I can do that.
That is for the that's for the Young Forest Project. Someone just put something in the chat as well. I can't see it fully, but the Young Forest Project website is up there, and the DEC's Young Forest Initiative. Here's the link for that as well. You can copy and paste those right to the website if you'd like.
Awesome. I am doing that now.
Yep. Any other questions from folks?
You're receiving lots and lots of thanks, and I thank you too, Roger.
Yeah, nope. Happy to do it. It's been, you know, it's an interesting topic. It's an interesting conservation issue. I'm seeing Joanne here. Main concern: the barren soil under a clear cutting. At least with blowdown damage, there's a buffer to the soil. That's a great point. That's a great point, Joanne. And there's different strategies with forest clear cutting. What some people do is you can go in and clear cut and remove all of the timber. There's reason to do that, right? Maybe it's firewood, maybe it's commercial timber harvest, whatever the case may be. That sort of strategy fully exposes the soil, and you have those negative impacts for sure. There are other strategies, though, where you can go in and conduct a clear cut and leave lots of coarse woody debris on the ground. And there's reason to do that. That sort of approach tends to protect the soil, tends to preserve some of that moist soil climate, microclimate. Leaving coarse woody debris can also help mitigate or lessen impacts from browsers like white-tailed deer as well. It basically makes the clear cut harder to access. Any final questions from folks? Okay, Becky, Suzanne, I think we're good.
Thank you so much, Roger. I can't wait to watch the recording and digest this massive amount of information even more.
Yeah, happy to do it. Thank you all for having me. And I look forward to continuing partnerships with you all down at Franklin Mountain. And we'll have to talk about ways to maybe get some students down there to do some invasive shrub management. Tom, if you're here, let's chat about that in the coming academic year.
Excellent. Thank you.
All right. Take care, folks. See you.
Take care. Bye-bye.